So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for this webinar today about discovering music by Indigenous composers. My name is Connor Chi. I am a Diné or Navajo pianist and composer. And before I get started, just a couple things to remind you that this webinar will be archived on the MTNA members only section of their website. And also, if you have any questions that come up during the presentation, I am going to save time at the end for a Q&A. So this presentation will be a brief overview of a variety of different Indigenous composers in different styles. One of the goals, I think, perhaps is to shift your perspective maybe on what Indigenous sound is and what Indigenous composers bring to the table. I think one of the things that I've come across in my experience as a musician and just as an Indigenous person is for those who aren't that familiar with Indigenous communities, there are sort of preconceived conceptions of what to expect indigeneity is, or what is Indigenous music. And I think it's very common for, if you're thinking of Indigenous music, you think of the Native American flute or the powwow drum, when in reality, those are just a part of a very diverse spectrum. There are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States alone, and there's many more than that that aren't federally recognized, all with different languages and different types of music and different culture and customs. So my goal is to kind of give a very brief overview of these composers, and hopefully as a starting point for you to do your own research as you are interested. I'll start out by talking a little bit about my music, my inspirations as a composer and what I do. And then I will go ahead and share some other composers and some videos and examples of their music. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the presentation now. And I'll begin, like I said, just by talking about some of my own music. I started out composing. I started out as just a performer. I focused on piano performance, and I came home to do more of a preservation project and try and preserve some of the music that my grandfather would sing, the traditional Navajo songs and chants. And basically, it inspired me to start making some arrangements on the piano. And my first album included this collection of Navajo vocables for piano. For those not familiar, vocables are the non-lexical syllables that are used in Indigenous chants to carry melodic lines and to mark formal structures in the music. This is a set of 12 pieces for solo piano that was influenced by Navajo, or Diné, as we call ourselves, Diné, corn grinding songs, and chants from the Enemy Way ceremony. The pieces can be divided into 3 movements. They can be performed individually, or the whole set, or these sets of 4. And I've grouped them into 4. I'll talk a little bit in a moment about why they're grouped into sets of 4. Corn grinding songs in Navajo culture were originally meant, obviously, to accompany the group task of grinding corn, but today they're performed for their musical value. You can see them sometimes on Facebook, streaming live, or on albums. And the Enemy Way ceremony is a healing ritual that's performed for returning soldiers to counter harmful spirits. And something associated with the Enemy Way ceremony is a girls' dance, and that is where the chants and songs from that girls' dance is what I actually use, because the Enemy Way ceremony is a sacred thing, and we don't share the music from that specific ceremony and other ceremonies publicly. But the girls' dance, some of the things are performed more publicly. So that's another thing that is always good to keep in mind when approaching Indigenous music, is that there are a lot of things that are sacred that aren't shared, which is why it's great to approach Indigenous composers themselves, because they'll know what is appropriate to share as a public piece of music and what's not appropriate. So what I'm going to share first is my Navajo vocable for piano number 1 from this set, and I'm going to show a couple of videos. So first, the video I want to show is just a short 1-minute video of the chant that this was actually based on, and then I will play the actual piece afterwards. So this is the chant that is a corn grinding song.
show, oh, hey, oh, hey, how, hey, hey, how, hey, away, mamo, away, mamo, away, away.
So now I'll play the piano arrangement that I did of this piece that was inspired by that corn grinding song, a little bit about it. The number 4 is sacred in Diné culture because we have 4 directions, 4 sacred stones, 4 sacred mountains, and that comes back a lot in the ceremony and also in just how we lead our life as the number 4. So since harmony was not originally included in Diné music, the harmonies that I added were often quartal and quintal to sort of reference that sacred part of the culture. That's kind of one of the ways I'm bringing the culture into this classical style. Also, the theme is repeated 4 times, which is often the case in traditional Diné songs and chants and prayers. Things are often repeated 4 times. And you'll hear some of the motifs from that corn grinding song that sort of span across all corn grinding songs. And it's used throughout this piece, and that kind of signifies where it comes from. So that piece actually was added to the Royal Conservatory of Music piano syllabus for 2022, and it's in level 10. The next piece that I'll talk about is Coyotes. This was a piece from the album I did based on the Navajo creation story. The coyotes were some of the earliest beings in our creation. There were 2 coyotes, Great Coyote and First Angry. And First Angry was the being that actually brought witchcraft into the world. There are a ton of different coyote tales in the Diné culture. Sometimes the coyote's cunning and clever, sometimes the fool, the jealous fool, but definitely always was responsible for moving things forward in our emergence. And so I have here a piece that was originally for piano that I made, I arranged for violin and piano, and I have a video of Stefan Milenkovic, the Serbian violinist, performing this piece. So I'm going to be talking about one more piece of mine, and then I'm going to move on to some other composers. But this last piece is actually a little bit related to the one that you just listened to. So this is The Water Monster, and it is also from my collection of pieces about the emergence story. We went through 4 worlds, and in the third world, there was a great water monster. And one of the coyotes kidnapped one of the water monster's children. There's a few different versions of the story. One is that it was out of jealousy because he saw all of the other beings were having children, so he kidnapped the water monster's child and started shouting about, "Oh, look, I have a child as well." Some say that he kidnapped this child because of its beautiful hair. But in any case, it angered the water monster greatly. And so therefore the water monster created a huge flood. It's interesting that in our creation story, there's a great flood, as in many other creation stories from different cultures. But this is what forced all of the beings and the people to move upward out of the third world and into the fourth world. And eventually the water monster's child was returned. So I'm going to share this piece, which borrows a few themes from the piece that you just heard, since that coyote was involved in this story with the water monster. So that was a couple examples of how my music that I compose is influenced by my background. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some other composers, starting with Lewis Ballard, who you may have heard of, you might not have heard of, but many refer to him as the father of Native American composition. He was one of the first well-known Indigenous composers. His father was Cherokee and his mother was Quapaw. And Ballard merged elements of Native American culture and music with Western classical music. And he managed to keep his traditional language and his culture alive despite being discouraged by the boarding school that he attended. If you're not familiar with the residential schools, there was something like 150,000 Indigenous children that were taken from their families and put them in boarding schools where they were stripped of their culture and their language and suffered great abuse. And we're still feeling the effects of this today. A lot of language that has been lost or is being lost because of these generations of Indigenous peoples were put in these boarding schools and taught that, teaching your children the language is going to hold them back, or teaching them the culture or the dances is going to hold them back in modern society. And it really was a cultural genocide. So, luckily, Lewis Ballard was able to persevere and keep his tradition and language alive and include that in his compositions. He composed a huge variety of music for different instruments and ensembles. He wrote ballets, chamber music, orchestral works, and solo works as well. I really enjoy his solo piano pieces, American Indian preludes. So if you're not familiar with Lewis Ballard, definitely take some time to look for some of his music. Also, another composer I'd like to highlight is Raven Chacon. He's a Diné composer originally from Fort Defiance, Arizona, Navajo composer like myself. He composes chamber works, opera, choir, solo music, and performs noise music. He has a really, really interesting approach to sound and how he works in the sonic space with the instruments. And so he actually just this past week received the 2022 Pulitzer Prize for Music for his Voiceless Mass, which was a piece that he composed for pipe organ and large ensemble. He served as composer in residence with the Native American Composers Apprenticeship Project, which is the outreach program for the Grand Canyon Music Festival, where they actually focus on reaching out and teaching music and composition to the Native American youth. So Raven Chacon's a really amazing composer. Definitely check out some of his music if you're not familiar already. It's really a totally new perspective on sound, like I said. Another composer, and I actually have now some musical excerpts that I've got permission to share with you all today, luckily. So Dawn Avery. Dawn Avery is a Grammy-nominated recording artist, composer, cellist, vocalist, and educator. And she merges traditional Mohawk elements with classical music. She also composes for film and theater. And she toured recently with the North American Indian Cello Project, which was an amazing thing, premiering contemporary classical works by a variety of Native composers. She runs a world music program at Montgomery College in Rockville, Maryland, where she's a professor. And the piece that I'm going to share with you, Onekasona Yakonkwe, which translates as Water's Women, was a piece commissioned by the duo Concertante, and that's who will be performing it, Nancy Don and Tim Steeves. And it was dedicated to MMIWG. For those of you not familiar with that, it is a movement of dedicated towards missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Indigenous women and girls are murdered at a rate 10 times higher than any other ethnicity. And so it's a movement to try and end the violence against Native women and get more resources for when they go missing. And so this piece was dedicated to the families and to them. And it's based on that symbiotic relationship between water and women who are both life givers, essentially. So it's a really beautiful piece. And I'm going to play just a little bit of an excerpt, not the entire thing, but I'll play a little bit for you today.
Te etino eladune onega sua
So really incredible piece, and you can find, if you want to listen to the rest of it, it is on YouTube. Another composer I'd like to talk about is Brent Michael Davids. He's a member of the Stockbridge Munsee community, the Mohican Nation. He's a composer, flautist, educator, producer, writer, and director. He writes for a variety of different instruments and ensembles, and he also does film scores. He's done quite a few films, actually. And the piece that I'd like to share with you from Brett Michael Davis today is Taptonahana for solo flute. That translates as "we speak" in the Mohican language. So I'll play an excerpt of this. This was a piece that was commissioned by the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra for Julia Bogorod-Kogan. And it is a mix of Indigenous and Western solo flute stylings. So you'll see just in this short excerpt the different approach that he takes as a composer to how the flute is used as an instrument, merging that Indigenous style and the Western flute stylings. Really, really interesting and beautiful piece. Okay, the next composer I'd like to talk about is Beverly McIver. I feel like I'm really flying through these. Like I said, I really wanted this to be sort of a starting point to just introduce you to some new composers that you might not have heard of, and also some resources for you to dive a little deeper. So Beverly McIver is a First Nations composer, pianist, educator, living on unceded Algonquin territory in Ottawa, Canada. She's a member of the Lac Seul First Nation, Anishinaabe, in Treaty 3. And her music explores themes of connection to the land, identity, and recovery of Indigenous knowledge through her music. She composes for singers, instrumental ensembles, and solo piano. I believe she's also composed for the Carillon. Really interesting music. And what I'd like to share with you today is a couple pieces from her Canadian Floral Emblem Suite for solo piano. Two of them, Lady Slipper and Trillium, and those are both level 6 in the 2022 Royal Conservatory of Music piano syllabus. And she was kind enough to allow me to share this video where she talks a little bit about her pieces and then performs the first two.
Welcome to the Canadian Floral Emblems final concert. I'm Beverly McIver. I live in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, on unceded traditional Algonquin territory. Today, I am pleased to perform the entire Canadian Floral Emblems suite for you. I was honored to be awarded a Digital Originals grant from the Canada Council. The idea that I submitted on my application began last year when I visited the Purdon Conservation Area near Perth, Ontario, to visit a colony of lady slippers, which has been nurtured for many years. I was so inspired by the enchanting display that I promptly went home and wrote a short piano solo. A friend pointed out to me that the lady slipper is Prince Edward Island's provincial flower. A year later, I wrote a song for Ontario's Trillium as a composition exercise. Without intending, I now had the beginnings of the Canadian Floral Emblems suite. I applied for the grant to write a piano solo for each provincial and territorial floral emblem. My first performance took place on August 9th on Facebook, and the series concluded on November 1st. Each composition has been a discovery for me of the flowers, their habitats, provincial history, and personal stories shared by friends. Today's program will be presented in the same order that they were created and performed in my biweekly concerts. The titles will be provided in the video. There are 13 pieces, one for each of the 10 provinces and 3 territories. Some of the pieces were invoked by my childhood memories of certain flowers. When I was unfamiliar with the flower or the place, I reached out to some friends to provide insight. I am grateful to Norma, Wendy, Jane, and Ashley for taking the time to share their recollections and deep love for the land. I hope that this collection conveys a sense of connection to the land and allows you to envision the unique characteristics of each flower, province, and territory, wherever you may reside.
Really beautiful music. Like I said, that's level 6 in the RCM. Next, I want to talk about Melody McIver. And yes, they're related. Beverly is Melody's mother. Uh, Melody McIver is a composer whose musical work integrates electronics with Western classical music to shape a new genre of Anishinaabe compositions. She's the current recipient of Canada's Council's Robert Fleming Prize, which is awarded to an exceptionally talented young Canadian composer. And she's currently, they are currently assistant professor of music composition at the Brandon University School of Music. And Melody composes choral, chamber, solo, and electroacoustic music, as well as film scores. And I'm going to share an excerpt of Melody performing one of her compositions that includes electronics as well as the traditional classical approach.
That first song was Nigani, and this one's
Really incredible, mesmerizing music. Next, I'd like to talk about Jared Tate, who is a Chickasaw composer from Oklahoma, a really incredible composer dedicated to the development of American Indian classical composition. His music merges Chickasaw culture with classical music, and he creates orchestral works, opera, ballet, chamber music, and film scores. He's a guest composer, conductor, pianist for San Francisco Symphony. They recently commissioned another work for him. And what I want to share with you today is an excerpt. It's sort of a small trailer for Shell Shaker, a Chickasaw opera. And this is based on the epic Chickasaw legend of how they received turtle rattles as their primary percussion instrument in music. Really, really incredible music. I've got two more I want to speak about. Next is Jacqueline Wilson, who is a bassoonist, composer, performer, pedagogue, collaborator, and advocate from the Yakama Nation, currently serving as assistant professor of bassoon and theory at Washington State University. She is an avid supporter of new music. She frequently collaborates with composers on the creation of new works to expand the repertoire. She commissions a lot of works. She also co-hosts the Double Reed Dish podcast, which is a really interesting podcast. If you're not aware of that, definitely check it out. She wrote a dance suite for solo bassoon, and each movement is inspired by one of the dance styles of the contemporary powwow dance complex. So I just want to share one movement of that, which is incredible. And this is based on the men's traditional dance. Beautiful. One last person I want to talk about before I wrap things up is Renata Yazzie. Renata is a Diné Navajo pianist, musicologist, and composer. Her research focuses on the intersections of Diné song and music with religion, theory, pedagogy, popular culture, and neurochemistry. She's a really interesting person. She created the first music dictionary in Diné Bizad, which is how we say the Navajo language in Navajo. She composed a set of solo piano pieces based on animals. And so the one that I'm going to share with you today is a short piece, which is titled Shashiaj, which in Navajo means little bear, Shashiaj. And it tells the story of a little bear who goes on a walk with his mom and encounters other animals and a lovely stream before returning to the forest. So that wraps it up for today. One other thing, if you've enjoyed the music you heard today and you want to find out more, or you want to find other composers I didn't have time to highlight, Renata Yazzie has actually done something really incredible and created the North American Indigenous Music Resources. So that is a webpage that contains an ever-growing list of North American Indigenous musicians, bands, composers, and other artists in all genres. And it's always growing, and it's sort of a starting point, like I said, for individual research. It's on her website. This is the address that you can find it. You can also just Google Renata Yazzie to find her website, and it is easy to find there on the website. So it has links to all of the composers, as well as their own web pages or social media, so you can contact them or find their music or find the sheet music for those that offer that for sale. And so now I'm just going to take a little bit, and I'm going to go ahead and pop on over to the Q&A. Let me take a look here. Okay, from Paulette. Would it be okay to perform publicly, recital or church live stream? I can say definitely yes for my music, and something kind of I mentioned in the beginning. One of the reasons I really think it's important that Indigenous composers are the ones in presenting these Indigenous melodies and themes and other things is because the Indigenous person will know what is appropriate to share in these formats and what isn't. So for my music, I specifically chose things that were appropriate to be shared. From Kathleen, I recently read the Indians book, originally published in 1905 by Natalie Curtis, where she notated many melodies, and I wondered what one would do with harmony. Your pieces are so imaginative. Are you familiar with Natalie's work? Thank you so much. I'm not familiar with Natalie's work, but yeah, harmony is such an interesting thing. Like I kind of described what I did with it, but that's just one way that, as you heard throughout the presentation, there's so many different approaches to how to bring the music, and not just the melody, but there's so much more that comes from the culture and the customs and the language that can be included without necessarily taking direct melodies or chants or things like that to the music. From Sarah, what beautiful pieces. As a teacher, though, I'm wondering about sources for pedagogical pieces at the early levels that I can use with my piano and violin students. Yes, there's definitely right now not a ton of pedagogical music, and that is actually something I'm working on along with a few other composers and institutions to hopefully in the next within the next year bring together some more pedagogical material from Indigenous composers to be able to include. So you can definitely look at the Indigenous resources list, and there is some stuff out there, but hopefully there will be more. Okay, from Sarah Strickland, beautiful pieces as a teacher. Oh, sorry, I just answered that one. Joseph Barlow, I'm wondering what your views are on the Indigenous composers of the early 1900s, such as Arthur Farwell, Harvey. Yeah. So the Indigenous movement, for me, really kind of missed the mark, and there's a few reasons. One is that it had that same extractive model of just taking from cultures, people coming from outside of these communities and taking things, and it also sort of from some of the pieces, not all of them, but they sort of combine different melodies from different tribes, and it sort of pushes this pan-Indian identity, where, as I said in the beginning, there are so many different tribes, so many different cultures, each unique. And, so often we think of Native American or Indigenous or First Nations as one group when it's very diverse, lots of different culture. And, just because I am Native from the Navajo Nation doesn't mean that I would, know something about the Hopi language or their culture and custom. And, the approach to using the music that's appropriate and the cultural significance, that's all stuff that's really missing from the Indigenous movement, just from the nature of the fact that they were not part of the community and grew up surrounded and steeped in that culture. So that's why I think it's really important to advocate for Indigenous composers that bring so much more than just a snippet of a melody or, a melody that was recorded and written down and put into a different style. Okay, I've just got to see. Juliana Connor, we need to get together regarding what we talked about in emails. I'm back. Yes, I am back in the Valley now for the moment. I've been traveling a lot, but yes, I'm back at the moment. Andrew Dunn, would you give permission for your own works to be lightly arranged? For example, I'm thinking about the Coyotes violin and piano arrangement and would love to perform it myself. I'm a cellist, so would have to transcribe and edit a bit. Yes, definitely. Reach out through my social media, which I forgot to post. I had a slide, but if you go to my website, connorchi.com, it has all my social media and ways to contact me, and I'm on Instagram and Facebook, so I'm definitely always happy to communicate about my music. and some arrangements. That's how a lot of these arrangements have come about, is that people have approached me because I really started just writing for piano for myself, and I've sort of expanded from there and been composing for other instruments and doing arrangements of other pieces I've already written. Lily, some pieces sound pentatonic with minor third motifs, very refreshing. In my music, definitely. And, you know, pentatonic melody is very common. It's largely pentatonic, at least I know for Navajo music. And the minor third motifs is something that is found in a lot of corn grinding songs. A falling third, minor third, sort of signifies what type of a song that you're going to be hearing. And so that kind of is woven into a lot of different chants. And there's different motifs. Well, some are minor thirds, some are, you know, perfect fourths. And as you listen to, you know, some of the original chants and some of the music that I've done and some that other musicians perform, they definitely come back and sort of have this cohesive sound that glues everything together. So yes, thank you so much, everyone, for joining me, and for thank you for the opportunity to present this music and these composers. Thanks to the composers who were so generous as to give me permission to share these videos and music with you today. And if you want to keep in touch, like I said, you can find my website, connorchi.com, and all of my social media. And thanks again, everybody, for joining.